Hello and welcome to Miniature Adventures. I'm Big Lee, and today I want to discuss the sad demise of small museums. So anyone that knows me will know I love to visit museums. If you've ever read my blog, you'll know I'm always posting photographs, photo reports of museums that I visited, and obviously with a particular emphasis on military history museums, but all sorts of museums. If it's anything to do with history, then I'm definitely in there. And they're a constant source of inspiration, knowledge, entertainment, and of course I'm always taking photographs. Again, anyone who knows me, I know I take far too many photographs when I visit museums, and I'm always using those pictures then to try and promote the best examples of the museums that I visited. So I'll tell you what the good, bad, and the ugly about them, and I'll say whether a place is worth visiting or not. And of course, I'm trying to do a bit of that on YouTube as well now, as well as on my blog. So the potential loss of small museums here in the UK, at the very least, is certainly something that concerns me quite a lot. Now, I recently, a week ago, I got back from a holiday from Lancashire, and as usual, we did our usual thing. To break up the journey, we went to some big museums. So I did RAF Cosford, Imperial War Museum North, for instance. But the big museums tend to have very solid funding, and their futures, although they've had a rocky time, like all businesses, their futures are relatively secure. But while we were away, in between all the other sorts of things that we do as a family on holiday, we were looking for things to do. We go and visit a small town. So, right, is there a local museum to visit? Oh, that one's shut. Well, what about this little private collection here? No, that's not open at the moment, or it's only open on certain days. And it was very clear, a noticeable change from previous years when we've been away, and you can always find a little local museum that's sort of like the heart of the local community, or a private collection that is now making the focal point for a small collection. Many of these were closed. Don't know whether that's permanent or temporary, but they were closed to the public in the height of the summer season, and now that everything's open, they should have been open, have their doors open. And some of them seem to have disappeared entirely or had very limited hours. And the question that sort of kept bouncing around inside my head is, has COVID and has lockdown killed off some of our smaller museums? So military museums in particular, the smaller ones I'm talking about, the small regimental collections or private collections that have been made available to the public, they often rely very heavily, obviously, on donations and entrance fees to pay those essential bills, keeping the lights on at the very basic level, keeping the roof from leaking, that sort of thing. And a lot of small museums, unlike the bigger examples, a lot of the smaller museums don't have the benefit of things like lottery funding, and they rely quite heavily on their rather meagre retail sales and obviously footfall through the door, donations of people that have visited. A lot of these little museums run on a shoestring, and they're entirely reliant on people coming in, leaving donations, buying a few bits in the shops. Many of them don't have a very strong web presence to push themselves and to sell stuff. So being shut has probably hit them very, very hard. And it's quite likely that many of these small ones will have been taken right to the edge of whether it's viable to keep them open. And those ones, the examples that we came across that appear to be shut now, I'm hoping it's temporary, but it could very well be that they've effectively gone bust. They're running on a shoestring, they've run out of money, and they can't continue, which would be a great shame. And then, of course, the other thing, the way that lockdown may have hurt small museums, is they often rely very heavily on volunteers. Smaller museums, particularly small collections or small local museums, may only have one or two paid members of staff. Everybody else, all of the other work and the work of keeping the place open and talking to visitors and running the shop is often done by volunteers. And of course, during lockdown, when we was all told to stay at home, those volunteers went home and maybe haven't come back for a variety of reasons. Volunteers tend to be older people because we have more time one way or another, and so they may have succumb to COVID, which would be a tragedy, but also they may be slow to come back because of continued and ongoing fears about COVID, particularly in a public-facing role like running a museum. And then, of course, any interest in things like volunteering, it would fall off if you stop doing that volunteering. So if you're told to not come because the museum's shut for a whole year, maybe you found something else to keep you interested, or your interests have moved on. So just because you had a pool of volunteers when the museum locked down way back in the middle of last year doesn't mean that same pool of volunteers is available when you decide to magically reopen now. And without those volunteers, there's lots of things that museums can't do. I was chatting to one guy in a museum last week, and he said that over half of his volunteers were unable to return to work, limiting what the museum could do. It couldn't do new exhibitions, it couldn't even do things like some days it didn't even have a member, somebody around who could clean the toilets or man the shop. And of course that has a knock-on effect in other ways, because while maybe the only paid member of staff is running around doing all those sorts of jobs, they're not spending time advertising and keeping the website up to date if they have a website, or running events. So all of these things need manpower as much as anything else. And the lack of volunteers can seriously affect a small collection's ability to promote itself and keep itself going and attract visitors. Now, this struck a chord with me because I remember reading an article back in January, and I believe it was in the museum's journal, and it was mentioned on the news and on various websites about the potential demise of small museums over the winter period, the period of the UK's last big lockdown due to coronavirus. And the UK Art Fund was reporting that many small museums were going to struggle during that winter period. And there was an article in the Guardian a few months later that mentioned that there'd been over 4,000 redundancies amongst paid employee staff, and up to 60% of small and medium-sized museums were actually worried about their ability to keep going, that they were at risk of imminent closure. And unfortunately, while there's been lots of money ploughed into other types of schemes to support other industry sectors, things like the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, for instance, for hospitality, the amount of money that's been available through things like the Arts Council for museums and cultural centres and so on is way less than is actually needed. In fact, I think it was the Arts Council mentioned that they'd only been able to support 15% of the applications for grants that had come into them in the first half of this year. I may be wrong with that figure, but I remember reading that somewhere, about 15%, which shows that the vast majority, 85% of those requests for emergency funds have had to be turned down. And of course, if a museum can't find another revenue source, that could be the end of that small museum. If that means paying the rent, or fixing that leaking roof, or just keeping the electricity going so that you can actually open the doors to visitors. And of course, it's also worth remembering that a lot of particularly local museums, so we're talking about your local natural history museum or a local history museum within a small village or a town, for instance, they often get funding through the local authority, and of course those local authorities are also struggling with their own finances. I mean, local authorities have tended to have their funding cut enormously over the last 10-15 years anyway. Our local council here is often quoted as saying that their funding from central government has dropped by 40%, and that was before COVID hit and put all sorts of additional pressures on them. And so some councils are having to make real hard-nosed decisions about where they spend their funding, and that may mean cutting funding to a local cultural things such as local museums. So that's another reason why smaller museums in particular, that whose finances are on a knife edge, can really struggle. And particularly small military museums, they tend to be less I don't know, less glamorous in some ways. You know, a town might support its 150-year-old natural history museum that's been an institution and a part of the town, but would they necessarily want to put funding towards a small military collection that is also on display nearby? So miniatures, I think, what I've found, and this is purely anecdotal from me looking for places to visit, is that a lot of these small military museums seem to have closed or have very limited hours now. And I'm sure a large part of that is down to a lack of volunteers and a lack of funding. Now, it has to be said that not everything is negative, right? While some museums have clearly struggled to survive, they've also had some surprising positives that have come about. Some museums have taken the time, if they've had the funds and they've been able to keep some of their volunteers active, they've been able to take time to revitalise their collections, put on new exhibitions, change around things, and generally do some work that couldn't be done while the public were in there. I know a lot of the more medium-sized and the larger museums have put a lot of information out there online. They've been using their websites really well. I mean, I was a member of the British Museum members group, and we were receiving information every couple of weeks. We were getting e-updates, sort of like electronic exhibitions and so on. But of course, that's not always within the capabilities of smaller museums, so they might not have been able to do that. Some have, some haven't. And at the end of the day, as with all things, and as I've mentioned several times, it always comes down to money. Even those with reserves will have found the last 16 months a very challenging and difficult period. So why am I discussing it? This is a channel about my wargaming hobby after all. Well, as I've mentioned many times, I find local military museums a really important source of inspiration. Photographs, reference materials, they really do need your support at the best of times. And there are ways that you can continue to help them and make sure that they survive and continue to provide that educational resource to wargamers and normal folk alike. Volunteer if you can. If there's one that really infuses you and is accessible to you, then try to volunteer if you can. Every extra pair of hands, even if it's only a few hours a week, would be really helpful. Donate online if you can afford to. Every little bit is valuable, especially if you're in a position to be able to, if you're here in the UK, for instance, you can gift aid, which means they can get some tax back on the money that you've donated, and they make more out of your donation than they otherwise would. And then visit those museums that are open, support them, go in there and pay that entrance fee and spend a little bit of money in the shop. They need support. Now that they can reopen, they need to have visitor numbers through the door. And as I've said, buy in their shop, either personal or online. If a small museum does have a website and you can buy a book or another little item and it's something that you want, try and get it through them if you can, because again, it will help support, keep them going. And then, the easiest thing you can do is just to promote these small museums. You come across a really good small local history museum, military history museum, or something that really, really infuses you. Tell people about it. Highlight it in your social media. Put it on your blog. Vlog about it. Free advertising basically for those museums. It can mean a lot to them. That sort of free advertising that they couldn't get elsewhere can mean an enormous amount to small museums. So I hope you found that interesting, and as always I'd say to you, if you've got a local museum that near you that needs your support, tell us about it. I'd love to hear what examples you have near you. Or do you have examples of ones that have unfortunately gone by the wayside, that haven't survived the last 16 months? Have you seen examples of lockdown innovation, such as new exhibitions being used? I'm particularly interested in those smaller museums that perhaps don't have the resources of the bigger ones. I'd always, as always, I really do love to hear your stories and your examples and your opinion on this whole subject, in fact. So that's it for this week. Very quick, just something that was on my mind having come back from our little holiday last week. So if you enjoyed that video, please join the conversation in the comments below or over on my blog, Big Lee's Miniature Adventures. And of course, if you did enjoy it, please like, subscribe and share. So until next week, stay safe, get in as many games as you can, and of course keep rolling high.